Hello, good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. Alex Schwartz, Deputy Director of the Center for Comparative Public Law. Welcome, all of you. It's really a great pleasure for me and for our center to be hosting Professor Stefan Voigt here today. He is Chair Professor of the Economic Analysis of Law at the University of Hamburg. He has written all kinds of great things. So if you're interested in the rule of law, judicial independence, efficiency in judicial institutions, the relationship between constitutions and economics, corruption in judicial systems, judicial independence. I mean, the list goes on. If you're interested in any of these topics, Professor Voigt has probably written some of the sort of cutting-edge, best work in these areas. So it's a great pleasure for me personally because I'm a kind of a fan of Professor Voigt's work. So it's a real pleasure for me to have him here today to talk about emergency constitutions. So this is empirical work. I'm really excited to hear the findings, and I don't want to spend any more time talking myself because Professor Voigt will have a lot to communicate to us. So I won't, without further delay, Professor Voigt.
Well, thank you very much for the very, very generous introduction. Very, very kind. Thanks for having me. Actually, what we didn't talk about this morning is how much time do I have?
Oh, you have as much time as you like.
You shouldn't say that. I have many, many slides, so it is on. It should be on.
Okay. I think technically we have the room until noon.
Well, I'll try to be done.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk about emergency constitutions. Let me try to motivate the topic a little bit. So I don't know how well you can see this. This might be a bit small, but what I'm saying here is that over a course of 30 years, between 1984 and 2014, at least 137 countries declared a state of emergency at least once, and that's on the nation-state level. That's not on a local or state level, it's on the nation-state level. I'm saying at least 137 countries because we cannot really be sure that we are covering all emergencies that have been declared over that period of time. Now, oops, that was a bit quick. This is a picture. It shows that it seems to be en vogue to declare states of emergency. Even ISIS has declared a state of emergency once. I mean, they're not really controlling the state, but they're still declaring a state of emergency. So it seems that it's en vogue. There are a number of countries that have been under something that could be called a perpetual emergency. Syria, Israel, Egypt, almost without interruption since 1981. Now, why is this so important, or why could it be interesting to look into the consequences of emergency constitutions? Well, they have two far-reaching consequences. First, they imply shift in the balance of powers, away from the legislature, away from the judiciary towards the executive, supposedly. And secondly, they could imply suspension of some rights, at least some rights for citizens. So this is why I'm interested in learning more about emergencies and the legal regulation of emergencies. Now, 9 out of 10 countries contain explicit emergency, 9 out of 10 constitutions contain explicit emergency provisions, which I will now call emergency constitutions for short. Okay, so what I have in mind when I talk about emergency constitutions are those provisions that are entrenched in nation-state constitutions. In German, we have this word Notstandsverfassung, but my experience is it doesn't travel well into English. So this is when I talk about an emergency constitution, I mean those provisions in nation-state constitutions that explicitly deal with how emergencies are to be dealt with. Now, taking both their potential relevance and their actual use into account, it is striking how little we know about emergency constitutions. I mean, I know there is, philosophers have dealt with them, legal theorists have dealt with them, but this is more or less on a normative basis. But empirically, we know fairly little about them, and this is why we have decided to have a fairly longish research project on them together with Christian Bjørnskov, a colleague from Denmark, from Aarhus University in Denmark. Now, how will I structure my talk? This is basically what my plan for this morning. The first question is who has emergency constitutions, just to give you an overview over how they have developed over time, who has them. Secondly, when are they used? Having an emergency constitution obviously does not mean that you have to use it. So the second question is, once you have it, when are you likely to use it? The third question then is, are they effective? I mean, do they help to reach the goals they are supposed to be reaching? And then I'll try to sum up at the end. So this is a little sort of figure trying to chart the territory, if you want. So we can analyze emergency constitutions from a normative point of view. Who should be having the power? Should there be an emergency constitution, etc.? This is not what I'm concerned with this morning, but rather I'm interested in positive analysis. And then we can distinguish between endogenous and exogenous. So endogenous is basically, we are trying to explain the determinants of the adoption of an emergency constitution, and once we have them, we are trying to explain the determinants of their use. And then we can assume them to be given, to be exogenously given, and once we do that, we can ask, are they effective? So this is more or less the plan for this morning, to go through these three steps and not to talk about the normative part that one could also be talking about. So I'll start with the determinants of the adoption. So this is sort of a fairly longish timeline. This is covering more than 150 years, and it gives you the absolute number of countries that have constitutionalized emergency provisions. Okay. Now you could say, well, that is not very helpful because obviously the number of countries has greatly increased over these 150 years. So this is basically giving you the proportion of countries over, that part of countries that have an emergency countries over all countries that are in existence. So what you can see here basically is that we are now at 90%. 9 out of 10 countries do have an emergency constitution.
We have a touch screen.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I just noticed. That's okay. Let me see if Angel, no, previous. Okay, here we go. So this just gives you an overview over the reasons for which emergencies, states of emergency can be declared, can be called. And it's a comparison between 1950 and 2011, and you can see a number of trends like war and aggression, has become more important as a potential reason for calling. Internal security has become somewhat more important. National disasters have become a lot more important. Economic emergencies do not really play an important role. That's just to give you an overview over the reasons named in constitutions for declaring a state of emergency. Now, what we are trying to do is to do some sort of systematic empirical analysis. So we've come up with, we as Christian Björnsko and myself, we've come up with this index of emergency powers consisting of 6 variables. There's 3 cost components, what we call cost components, we economists, and 3 benefit components. And so the cost components are basically covering how difficult it is to call a state of emergency. Who has the power to do so? Who needs to approve? Etc. Okay. So those are the cost components, and then the benefit components. Benefit from the point of view of the executive, of the government. So what do I gain by declaring a state of emergency? Can I dissolve parliament? Can I postpone elections? Can I constrain human rights, etc. Okay. And so we quote all these 6 variables between 1 and 0. 1 is always sort of the best possible world for the executive, okay? Whereas 0 is the best possible world for the rest of us, or for the legislature. And 1, this implies that 1 basically indicates an essentially unconstrained executive. Now, one observation is that there's no substantial differences in index values between democracies and non-democracies, which we didn't expect to find that. So if you just read the constitutions of these countries, if you just read their emergency provisions, and if you then code them, you do not find a systematic distinction between democracies and autocracies. Now, how about this index? The development of this index over time. as you can see, the powers of the executive during a time of emergency have increased over this 60-year period. Okay, the index value was, the average over the countries that had an emergency constitution in 1950 was something like 0.225, and it's now something like close to 0.35. So it has increased. Just to check sort of the plausibility, I'm giving you some index values for recently passed constitutions: the Constitution of Kenya in 2010, Guinea in 2010, and Hungary. Now in Europe we talk a lot about Hungary and about sort of Hungary moving away from the rule of law, etc. Now the index value of the Hungarian constitution is 0.71, so it's really, really high. And I'm just giving you this to sort of give you a feeling for how this index performs over time, and to what degree it seems more or less plausible. Let me just sum up what I've said so far. So 9 out of 10 countries have emergency constitutions. Emergency constitutions tend to cover ever more issues. Remember the war and aggression, natural disaster stuff, etc. So the more and more issues were covered. And thirdly, emergency constitutions tend to allocate more powers to the executive, the timeline that you just saw on the last slide. So let's now move on. Can we identify factors determining differences in emergency constitutions? Okay, so what about the content? So what we are looking at as potentially relevant determinants is the frequency of disasters. Does it make a difference whether your country is really disaster prone for the content of your emergency constitution? I mean, if you are subject to typhoons very often, does that lead to your government or your constitution enabling your government to be more active during, in fighting a typhoon? Well, that was basically the idea. Then the composition of the Constitutional Assembly doesn't make a difference whether the Constitutional Assembly is basically dominated by people from the legislature or by people sent from the executive. It could mean that if the latter was the case, then that there are more powers given to the executive. Regime type, democracy versus non-democracy, occurrence of coups. Does it make a difference whether a country is subject to lots of military coups? Yes, no. And legal history. Does it make a difference whether you are sort of have a common law or a civil law background, and within civil law, whether you're French or German or Scandinavian background. And I have lots of results, and I'm not giving you any tables, no numbers, but still there's lots of information even in these bullet points here. So let me try to only tell you the most important ones. So regarding geographical factors, what we think is the most surprising result is that proneness to natural disasters. If you are Bangladesh, you are prone to floods, are negatively correlated with overall government powers. So it's not that government has more powers if the country is prone to natural disaster, but has less powers. And we basically try to make sense of that finding by saying, well, it's, if you are Bangladesh, you just know how to handle a flood because you've been handling that flood so often, so you probably don't need the additional powers that one could think of. So the next issue here, a way in which the Constitution is negotiated. So is the Constitutional Assembly, was it dominated by members of the legislature or the executive? Well, if it was dominated by the legislature, we find a number of things. It's more likely to constrain the power of the executive. So this is in line, if you want, with public choice or political economy considerations. Legislatures do not have such an inclination to pass powers, to delegate powers to the executive. So they constrain the executive more than if the Constitutional Assembly was dominated by members of the executive. So that's one central result. And yeah, just to give you a couple of examples here, countries with coups allocate more power to the executive, and some effects of legal origins. Now, common and French civil law, countries with more powers to executive compared to Scandinavian. Scandinavian is our comparison benchmark. So in that sense, we do not see the usual distinction between common versus civil, but here it's common and French civil are more or less than Scandinavian. Okay. So this was the first question. How am I doing on time? I guess I'm all right. So now let's move on to the second question, namely the determinants of their use. So now we've looked a little bit into who has emergency constitutions, what are the reasons for having different types of emergency constitutions. So now the question is, once you have an emergency constitution, under what conditions are you likely to use it? What I want to do is basically do three steps. I want to sort of present a number of hypotheses, then tell you something about the estimation approach, how we get to our results, and then present the results. So here's a picture. This is Trujillo, a guy who governed the Dominican Republic for decades. And the way he became president was a bit questionable, but then also the way he used emergency powers was subject to debate, let's say. After a huge hurricane passed by, Trujillo used this as an excuse to seize bank accounts, impose emergency taxes, and impose martial law on all citizens. And he basically stayed in power for decades. There were a couple of interruptions, but he was basically the strong man on that island for decades. And you could say, well, this is the 30s. This is almost 100 years ago. So here's a more recent example. 3 years ago, the then president of Ecuador basically declared an emergency before this volcano erupted. So the volcano had been inactive for many, many, many years. So he declared a state of emergency just before its eruption. So people were saying, well, maybe there's political economy reasons. Maybe he just enjoys the additional power from declaring a state of emergency rather than trying to fight the consequences of a volcano eruption. He actually did the same thing in the same year before El Nino could do any damage to Ecuador. So there is obviously, if you come from a political economy, a public choice perspective, the conjecture or the hypothesis that some politicians might use emergency powers to basically fight the opposition or to strengthen their own position in government, staying in government longer, rather than fighting the consequences of, say, a natural disaster. So if we try to translate this into a hypothesis, one could argue the larger the power differential that government enjoys under a state of emergency compared to the normal state, to the non-emergency, the higher the probability that it will declare a state of emergency. The more attractive it is for you in the sense of the more power, the more additional powers you enjoy, you can read from declaring a state of emergency, the more likely it is that you will declare it. That's a very straightforward political economy hypothesis. Hypothesis number two, the more difficult it is to secure consent to declaring a state of emergency, the more veto players you have, the more chambers, the more courts, etc., have to consent to your declaration of a state of emergency, the lower the probability of its declaration. So this is very simple cost-benefit analysis, if you want. Now, I want to say a little bit about the estimation approach, because it's not really tricky, but one has to think about it for a minute or two to understand what should be done and where the problems are. So the precondition for meaningfully identifying determinants is the following. We need to include situations in which a state of emergency could have been declared but was not. Okay? So we cannot only include those situations where there was a disaster and a state of emergency was declared, but we also need to have the situation where there was a disaster but no situation of no state of emergency was declared. Okay, so this is a bit the tricky thing, but once you're clear about this, then the rest follows sort of logically. So how did we get the data on potential states of emergency that were nevertheless never declared? Okay, so what we do is the following. we make a distinction between natural disasters on the one hand and, if you want, political emergencies, opposition, strikes, general, etc., domestic political issues. And so what we do is we include a natural disaster if at least 1,000 people were affected by any disaster during a particular year. Okay, so if and there is data banks for that. So we have there's an emergency data bank. So we just code 1,000 people affected. Yes, no. If there were 1,000 people affected from a natural disaster, we said they could have declared a state of emergency. And then for political emergencies, there's a different data set that looks at assassinations of politicians, general strikes, violent demonstrations, and so on. And if any of these events took place in a given year, we code the country year as potentially ready for declaring a state of emergency. Okay, and the nice thing is that, well, those are the results already. The nice thing about the entire sample is that in about 50% of all cases, an emergency was declared, and in the other 50%, an emergency was not declared. And the size of the disasters is about the same. So that gives us fairly high confidence that the results are reliable. So what are the results? First of all, it's crucial to distinguish between natural and political disasters, which makes sense. The behavior of politicians, depending on what is the causal factor for declaring a state of emergency, might be very different. Secondly, higher levels of domestic conflict increase the likelihood of calling a state of emergency based on political disasters. So exactly as one would expect. If there's more demonstrations, if there's more assassinations, if there's more general strikes, the likelihood of declaration increases. Parliamentary governments are somewhat less likely to declare a state of emergency than presidential ones, which is, in a sense, not in line with what we expected. Remember the hypothesis 1 that I said? The more additional powers you can get from a state of emergency, the higher the likelihood of declaring. Now, one would think that parliamentary governments would probably get more additional powers than presidential ones, so they would be more likely to declare. This is not the case. And again, there is no significant difference between parliamentary governments and autocracies. Okay, so that's also a bit unexpected. Now, how about the content of the emergency constitution itself? This is why it's in red. This is what we are really interested in. We find that the less costly it is for government to declare a state of emergency, the more likely it is to do so. Okay, so this shows that yes, it's a first indication that emergency constitutions might really have an effect. Okay, if they make it easy for government to declare a state of emergency, then government is indeed more likely to declare a state of emergency. So this is basically what we find here. Now let's move on to the third aspect here. Are they effective? And what I will do is I will basically make a distinction between natural disasters and political events. And I will start with natural disasters because, in a sense, the empirical test is a bit more straightforward and less cumbersome. Why is that? Because natural disasters are truly exogenous events. You know, if a typhoon will be hitting Hong Kong on Sunday, there's nothing much the Hong Kong government, the Chinese government, no government in the world can do about it. Yes, you can do something about it in the sense of, having building restrictions, building regulations, warning your population, telling your population what to do, what not to do, etc. But still, the event itself is exogenous. Okay. Now, this is completely different regarding domestic political events. The degree to which there is a terrorist incident occurring in your country might be a consequence of government behavior. So in that sense, it's endogenous. And that's why it's a little more difficult to deal with. So this is why I start with natural disasters as exogenous events, and I only look at terrorist incidents as an example for endogenous events in a second step. So to identify the effectiveness of emergency powers, I propose to analyze the interrelationship between three things, namely an event, the disaster, the institutions, the rules according to which the disaster can be dealt with, and the decisions of the actors. That is, what does government do? Okay, so we have a natural disaster, we have some rules, and we have the behavior of government. And basically, we need to somehow connect these three elements. Now, we cannot exclude ex ante that the type of disaster might also have an effect on the behavior and the outcome, right? So this is why we distinguish between biological, geophysical, hydrological, and climatic disasters. And the institutions basically is the emergency constitutions where we need this ENIP, the index, three cost components, three benefit components that I presented before. And then the behavior of the actors is basically proxied for by whether or not a state of emergency is being called. Okay, so that's more or less the setup. And just a word on where we get the information from. The information on natural disasters and their severity are from what is called the Emergency Events Database. That is a database that has been collecting all kinds of data on emergencies, which is located someplace in Belgium. There are some Belgian academics who run this database. And what we do here, that might sound a little strange, but let me try to explain it, what we're doing here. So obviously, let me start before the slide. So one way to look into the effectiveness of emergency constitutions with regard to natural disasters is how many people die, right? I mean, basically the idea is to give the government additional powers to prevent more and more people dying. So you want to be quick in relief efforts, blah, 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 and you might need additional powers for that. Now, obviously, there are very many different disasters, and you would have very many, the differences in the number of people dying could be very large, okay? So what we need to do is we need to control for the size of the event, right? To not mix apples and oranges, right? So how do we do that? What we do is we look at the number of people who are affected as a measure for the size of the event. You know, if it's 10 people, or it's 100 people, or it's 100,000 people, the size of the event might be very different. And this is basically the way we control for the size of the event. Then the dependent variable on the left-hand side, what we want to look at as the result of the whole effort is the number of people killed. Okay, so in a sense, it's that you could think of it as the proportion of those people who are affected who are killed at the end. Okay, we want this proportion to be as small as possible. And if it's very small, we would say the emergency constitution is effective. If 100% of those being affected are being killed, we would say the emergency constitution is very ineffective. Is that more or less? Okay. Okay, countries are only included in years in which MDAT, this database, records at least one natural disaster. Okay, so here we're not having all country years, and we have only country years in which there was a disaster. Okay, because we are interested in the effectiveness of the emergency constitution. So what are the explanatory variables? Well, this index of emergency powers, the dummy for state of emergency having been declared, which we take from Hafner-Burton, which goes back to 2011 and the years after, which we have coded ourselves. And to control for the context, we include geographic, economic, and political factors. Okay, so it might make a difference if you're in a very hilly or disaster-prone environment or not. That's the geographical factors. Might make a difference whether you're a rich country or a poor country, because if you're rich, you simply might have more means to deal with the effects of a disaster than if you're poor, and so on. So what have we got? We have a panel of more than 1,500 observations from 122 countries for the period between 1990 and 2011. So that's a, what is 22-year period. And this is a little bit about the estimation approach that we have. I don't want to talk about that at any length. So we include year fixed effects. So we basically all the differences that are not explicitly covered by our variables are all the time differences are covered here. The legal origins, the region fixed effects, so difference between Asia and Europe and the US, etc., will be covered by that. So what do we find? This is pretty much what one would expect. So the more people are affected, the more people are being killed. That's pretty straightforward. The higher the population of a country, the higher the number of people killed. That's also pretty straightforward. The higher the income of a country, the lower the number of people killed. This is all pretty straightforward, exactly as one would expect. Now, these are some of the more interesting results. So presidential democracies perform slightly better in preventing people from being killed than parliamentary ones, for whatever reason. Autocracies do not perform worse than democracies. Overall, the cost part of the INEP, sort of how difficult is it to declare a state of emergency, is not significant, but the benefit part is highly correlated with the log killed, implying that, and this is the really amazing part of it, and I'm still looking for a really convincing and plausible explanation. The more benefits the executive derives according to the emergency constitution, the more people die subsequent to a natural disaster. Which seems to be indicating that it could really be a pretext if there is a natural disaster. Some governments might really use that as a pretext and not act on fighting the consequences of disaster, but using the additional powers for other things. Then, if we go a little more fine-grained for geophysical and hydrological disasters in countries that make it easy to call a state of emergency, cost part of the INEP is low, or is high, more people are being killed. So, in a sense, we see that the benefit part of the INEP plays an important role in all kinds of disasters, but these two kinds of disasters, also the cost part plays an important role. So basically what we take away from this is that, again, we can show that emergency constitutions, the content of the emergency constitutions, does play a role for how effectively governments fight the consequences of, in this case, natural disasters. Okay. Now let me move one step further. This is the. I guess I've given you this more or less. So the next step, as I told you before, was to look into domestic incidents, or rather, I should say, endogenous incidents. And what we do here is we look at terrorist incidents as an example. There are other things that might one want to look at. Man-made disasters can also be factories that blow up. So those are a completely different type of disaster. We could also talk about general strikes, mass demonstrations, etc. But here we only focus on terrorist incidents. And so what we do is we do three steps in a word. Did any terror event occur in a country in a given year? If yes, did this terrorist incident lead to a state of emergency? And thirdly, did government repression level change as a consequence thereof? Okay. Now again, where do we get all the data from? There is a global terrorism database which covers the period from 1970 until 2016, and more than 60,000 events are being registered on that database, covering 82 countries. And we aggregate these 60,000 events on a yearly basis, giving us 3,585 country years. Okay, so it could be that one country never sees a terrorist incident, then we would not be so much interested in it. But it could also be that a single country observes 10 or 12 or 14 terrorist incidents in 1 year. So we aggregate that into a country year. Okay? So this is what we do. Secondly, we need information on the declaration of a state of emergency, which we have, as you know, because I've been talking about that. Thirdly, one question is, that can one show that the repression level of governments that have declared a state of emergency markedly increases after having declared such an emergency? And what we do is we get human rights information from a fairly recent data set by Ferris with higher values indicating less violations. We figured that it might be interesting, or it might make a lot of sense, to only include countries that have at least a somewhat similar legal structures. So what we do is we only include 79 countries that are democratic or have sort of Western-style constitutions. That has advantages because the homogeneity of the countries is a bit higher. We're covering countries from Europe, the Americas, and Australasia, but it also has definite disadvantages. And we've been working on a follow-up paper. The disadvantages, I don't have the map with me, unfortunately. If you look at the map of terrorist incidents, you will see that many, many, many terrorist incidents occur in the Middle East. Okay? And if you want, in the Muslim world, or in the large part of the Arab world. And we do not really cover that here. Okay? So in other words, a major part of terrorist incidents that have occurred in the world over this period here is not covered by this study. We are covering only these 79 countries. I can tell you that we've run the stuff for the Middle East. The results are somewhat similar, but there's also market differences. But I don't want to overload this presentation. So I'm just giving you the results for the 79 countries. So just a little bit on the estimation approach. We first estimate the likelihood that a terrorist event occurs. Given that an event did occur, we look at the likelihood of a state of emergency being declared. And well, this is a little bit about sort of the estimation approach, the strategy to deal with this endogeneity problem that I talked about before. And I assume most of you are lawyers, so I will not go into any of the details here. Let me just tell you that some economists believe this makes a lot of sense. Other economists say, it's a good attempt, but it's really not sufficient to deal with endogeneity. Okay, so we are open to criticism here. Some people like what we do. Some people say it's still not sufficiently. The endogeneity issue is still not sufficiently dealt with. So the issue really is if you have a government that tries to be tough on terrorists. Being tough on terrorists could induce additional events. Okay, so that's a bit the issue that's behind all this technical stuff here. So let me try to give you a summary of our results. So the first question is, what factors determine the likelihood of a terrorist incident? So this is more or less independent from the state of emergency issue. But I begin with the state of emergency bullet point. The reason is countries with a state of emergency are more likely to suffer again. So this is the following. So a state experiences a terrorist incident, declares a state of emergency, and then we look at what happens in the next year. So the next year, it's more likely than countries that do not have a state of emergency to experience another terrorist incident. Now, one way to interpret this result is, well, that is just a country that is prone to terrorist incidents. Another way to interpret this result is to say that, well, then maybe the emergency constitution is not so effective. If it was very effective, then another terrorist incident wouldn't be occurring. That's a bit up to discussion how to best interpret this result. Interestingly, right-wing / liberal governments are less likely to suffer from terrorist incidents. Countries without emergency constitutions are less likely to suffer. Remember, 10 out of 100 countries do not have constitutionalized emergency provisions. Those seem to be less prone to terrorist incidents. More government powers under ENIP, that is the benefit part of the ENIP, are correlated with more incidents. Okay, so in other words, it seems that if you endow governments with additional powers, it doesn't really help to reduce the likelihood of a terrorist incident occurring. This is also interesting. This is for a subsample which is not a lot smaller than those 79 countries, because among those 79 countries, most are democracies. So among the democracies of these 79 countries, I think it's like 75 or 74, what we observe very strongly is that high levels of civil society, that is, you have a lot of NGOs being active in a society, are correlated with lower likelihood to suffer from a terrorist incident. So if you have a very active civil society, it seems that more people can be integrated into society and less people are likely to sort of express their political preferences via violence. The second question, what factors determine if a state of emergency is being declared subsequent to terrorist incidents? Well, more events are correlated with a higher likelihood. That makes a lot of sense. And if a country suffers from more terrorist incidents or harsher terrorist incidents, more people killed as a consequence of terrorist incidents, the likelihood of declaring a state of emergency is higher. Richer countries are less likely to declare. Presidential democracies are more likely to declare than parliamentary ones. And right-wing / liberal governments are more likely to declare. So remember the last slide about right-wing liberal governments. So they suffer from a lower likelihood of suffering from an incident, but once an incident has occurred, they are more likely to declare a state of emergency. And interestingly, we also asked, well, does it, political economy consideration, does it make a difference whether there is an election coming up or not? And actually, I wasn't really sure about what to expect as a result, because one could have thought that if the population in general is afraid of terrorist incidents occurring, it would basically not reduce the popularity of government if it declares a state of emergency, even if a general election is coming up, right? If there's a high level of fear among the population, and the government says, yeah, we are in a difficult situation, and to make sure that nobody is hurt, we keep on living under a state of emergency. But this is not borne out by the data. So other things equal, the declaration of a state of emergency is less likely, significantly less likely, in an election year. So it seems that governments perceive the declaration of a state of emergency as reducing their popularity. I was a bit amazed about that result, but that's what we get. And finally, do repression levels change subsequent to a state of emergency? Well, more terrorist events are correlated with more repression. So if the more events occur and the more people die as a consequence of these events, the higher the likelihood that some human rights are being derogated from. More people are being killed. Well, as I already gave that to you. Larger countries repress more. Military dictatorships are particularly harsh. This is pretty much in line with what one would expect. The declaration of a state of emergency is connected with more repression. Okay. Let me just try to connect this result result number 3 with the first question, like the likelihood of a terrorist event occurring. There are some papers making an argument that if government is very harsh on particular groups that are suspected of terrorist incidents, this might backfire. Why? The argument is that basically what the police need to prevent terrorist incidents from occurring is people who are friends or family of potential terrorists who report activities to the police. Now, my son is toying around with a bomb. Why don't you have a look at him? Or, they're in our quarter, and my neighbor, they are making strange experiments at night, or they are always getting these huge packages with chemicals inside, or whatever. Okay. So what you need is informants that are sufficiently loyal to the police and the state as a whole to report such activities. Okay. Now, if the police and the state as such is very harsh on particular groups, it is said that the likelihood of these potential informants really going to the police and informing the police would decrease. And so this is basically the logic, and the question at the end of the day is whether being very harsh as a consequence of one terrorist occurring really decreases the likelihood of additional events occurring if you basically reduce the loyalty of friends and family of potential terrorists to the system as a whole. So this is basically the larger question behind the last part of what I was saying. Okay, let me try to sum up. What we find is that emergency constitutions are more than black letter law. They seem to have effects here and there. They do channel the behavior of governments. Now, their actual effects are sometimes not in line with their intended effects. Remember that declaring a state of emergency after a natural disaster increases or comes with a higher number of people being killed rather than a lower number of people being killed. One could ask, well, why are they not reformed? Why are they not improved? We suspect that this is because they are politically attractive. Politicians seem to, if you want, misuse emergency provisions fairly often. The next step should be to inquire more closely into the political economy of emergency constitutions. What we're doing right now is basically to look at the de facto implementation or the de facto behavior of governments under a state of emergency. So in a sense, emergency constitutions constrain government behavior. I mean, they enable additional government behavior, but they also constrain it. And what we're interested in is in finding out to what degree governments that have declared a state of emergency remain within the constitutional provisions once they have declared a state of emergency. This sounds pretty straightforward. It's not so easy because data availability is a problem. Just to give you one example, and then I'll stop. What we know fairly well is the date of declaring a state of emergency. There are, it's fairly easy. You can there's various data sets, but you can also use newspapers, and they're readily available. So we are fairly confident that we get the starting point of states of emergency right in most of the time. Now, one question to ask with regard to the de facto implementation is, do governments stick to the maximum length of a state of emergency? Now, some countries say it's a maximum length of 3 months or 6 months, like in Rome, the old dictators. So one natural question would be to ask, to what degrees do governments stick to the maximum time length? Now, obviously, what you need to know is not only at what date the state of emergency was declared, but also at what day the state of emergency was ended. Now, interestingly, many newspapers the world over report the declaration of a state of emergency, but they do not report the end of a state of emergency. So this is, this is just a very straightforward example of that it's a bit more difficult to get a handle on de facto implementation of emergency provisions than on the de jure stuff that I've presented you so far. And this is it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Voigt. We have some time for questions. I think technically we're here until 11:30, but I think the room is still free after that point. So we are not. Please.
Thanks for the very stimulating presentation. So just two questions. The first one is regarding the definition of the state of emergencies, which I missed probably the first part. I mean, do different countries have different definitions of state of emergencies, right? For example, I think one thing in your presentation is about like 1,000 people were killed, right? In different countries, it can mean very different things. So related to that, I'm just wondering whether you have considered the size of population of different countries. Smaller countries might be more likely to declare SOE or whatever. So that's my major confusion for myself question. The second one is a technical question. I think in one of the slides, you were saying that in your results, parliamentary regimes are less likely to declare SOE, and your explanation is that because you're saying that actually for parliamentary regimes they have more to gain, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive. But I'm just thinking that you were talking about the benefits, but how about the costs? Costs, right? For parliamentary regimes, it might be more costly or more difficult to declare SOE. Maybe you have considered that in your model, but anyway, just my questions.
Yeah, thanks for the question. You're completely right, and I sort of, with regard to your first question, we actually we are aware that if you just compare Hong Kong to mainland China, 1,000 people affected might mean very, very different things. So we also look at the proportion of the population. I think it's 1 per mil that we look at, and the results are fairly similar. So we did control for that, and I was, since it was not very clear on the slide, I was trying to get it in. Remember when I was saying that the sample falls into 50% of emergencies being declared and 50% of not being declared. And basically the characteristics of the events after which it was not declared and the characteristics of the events after which it's declared were fairly similar. So that was my way of trying to get over the imprecision on the slide. The second question, obviously, I mean, you can try to come up with stories like that, and I guess we need explanations like that because in a sense, at least prima facie, the result is somewhat counterintuitive. But then you have to think about what could be the reason behind it, and it could be that maybe also the assumption that parliamentary governments can gain more might not be entirely correct. I mean, they might be still subject to the vote of no confidence from Parliament. So in a sense, they might not be able to gain so much. Maybe the starting point, the assumption is not entirely correct. So yeah, we've been thinking in those lines.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I had a question about the general trend that you started with, that kind of framed the motivation for the talk, which was an increasing use of states of emergency or declarations of a state of emergency over a particular period, particularly from the end of the Second World War in Europe. One of the things that many commentators have suggested is accompanied alongside that is the use of normal legislative procedures to attain powers that were once reserved within emergency powers. So the introduction of terror acts, for example, that allow for the suspension of habeas corpus that was once...
You from Britain, or?
Yes,
okay.
that was once reserved for martial law or martial powers, but has been achieved through other means. So that seems to be a really significant factor in determining when emergencies are going to be used. If you have had, as many people will suggest, the kind of the normalisation of the exception in Europe,
Yes.
where emergency powers have been implemented through normal legislation.
The new normal.
The new norm. That you don't need to resort to emergency powers. But this seems particularly significant in the context of terrorism and terror offences.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just comment how that features in your analysis or not.
So you might remember that we were saying that 10% of all countries do not have explicit emergency provisions. Now, and they figure among those where the terrorist incidents do not play an important role. So it's interesting to look at them, and we're trying to do that. The problem is, so in general, we would be very interested in sort of statutory legislation regarding emergencies, and as you were saying, I mean, these have been particularly relevant with regard to terrorist activities, and particularly after 9/11. The issue is, it's a huge coding issue, in the sense that most constitutions of the world are by now available in English. Much of the relevant legislation on the statutory level would not be available in English. Plus, it would not always be clear what laws precisely to look for. I mean, as you were saying, I mean, I guess there have been counts of, both for your country as well as the U.S. The number of legislative acts that could be relevant for dealing with or trying to prevent terrorist activities, and it's an enormous number. So trying to get, I mean, I see the point. Obviously, it will be very interesting, and we are sort of thinking up and down and how we can handle this. But it's the possibility to get a good handle on the empirics is very difficult. We are aware of the problem. People have been suggesting, why don't you use like Google Translate? I don't speak so many languages, and we have a large team at my institute. We can cover quite a few languages, but we can definitely not cover all of them. So, I see the problem, but the practical issues are huge. Also, I mean, if I may sort of continue with another critical point, the possibilities of governments to rule by decree would be very, very interesting to look at empirically. But the definition of what is a decree and what powers a decree implies are very different from country to country. So again, we have huge problems of not comparing apples with oranges. And I've talked to people who've done lots of empirical work in this area. They've also been interested in the problem, and the answer to date has always been it's too difficult. But I think these two issues would be really, really interesting. The decree power issue also far beyond states of emergency. I mean, for like political scientists / politically interested lawyers, this would be highly interesting. It's very difficult to get a handle on that.
Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Jasmine from Malaysia. I'd like to share that the last slide really resonated with me. So I was born in 1978. Back in '69, May 15, there was a huge event between the opposition party. It was the first time the opposition party won, but there was a huge massacre. A lot of people were killed. This whole incident was erased from history books. I never studied about it. But my parents were right smack in the epicenter in Kuala Lumpur. So when you went through that, I was like, so a state of emergency was declared. There was a martial law being implemented. The past ruling party were not happy with the results because the first time opposition party won, and they were predominantly non-Malay, non-Muslim. So Malaysia is a Muslim country. I'm Chinese. There were a lot of killings, a lot of people being tortured and all that. Basically, they did not abide by the rule of law, or abide by, you know, the ruling party won, but they choose not to respect that. What happened was the government then imposed a affirmative action policy to appease the Malays. It was meant to just last for a few years, but it lasted for 50 years. And this year, during the general election, the opposition party won. But before that, there was such a huge paranoia, and my dad's still alive, he's 75, he lived through that. Every time there was a major election, he would stock up the whole, you know, kitchen and all that, because he went through the whole martial law. They had to stay in their houses, and then when they stepped out from the house, they would be killed. So it did happen in Malaysia. And you're very right as well with the last point. So with the new Malaysia in place, everyone is excited, but they're also very nervous. What's going to happen with the old affirmative policy? And what's going to happen? You know, what is the new normal now? So yeah, it's interesting times. But thank you for sharing that.
If I could, I have a quick question actually, Professor Voigt, which I think comes into play with some of the comments that have been already, or questions that have already been made. In constructing the index, and forgive me if this was sort of in the presentation, but is it the case that when we're trying to code the benefit that the executive derives from declaring the emergency provision, is this index keeping track of the sort of baseline for that particular jurisdiction? So is it an absolute measure of the executive power, or is it a measure that's sensitive to where the executive is starting from in terms of what the executive's powers are before the declaration?
No, the index is fairly simple. I mean, what we do is it's coded on an annual basis. So we can track all changes in constitutions. It only looks at the constitutional level and not at the statutory law level. And what we do is we look at 3 variables for the cost component: who can declare, who it needs to approve, and what conditions are being given for a possibility to declare. And the benefit component is, can Parliament be dissolved, can particularly a set of rights be derogated from, and one more. And basically we look at this on a fairly straightforward scale, I believe, between 0 and 1. So this is basically just in absolute terms, if you want, what it says. And then we try to, you know, this first hypothesis basically asks sort of which type of government is more likely to gain relatively more from this. And then the idea is, well, you know, parliamentary governments are subject to being voted down by a vote of no confidence, so that it could be more attractive for them to get the additional powers than presidential ones. But as you heard, this is not borne out by the data.
Yeah, yeah. It's an interesting kind of research problem. I suppose if there's error there and it's not systematic, then and it's sort of random, then it doesn't really disturb
It wouldn't really matter,
the
yeah.
findings. But an interesting thing, because I imagine for some jurisdictions, it's just more tempting because they're coming from a place where the executive might be more fettered to start with, whereas other places less tempting and that might not necessarily
The
track.
executive might be more
Fettered to begin with.
Okay.
Yeah. So in terms of just the powers that are normally enjoyed by the executive in that particular constitutional system. So yeah. So and then maybe that kind of follows relatively consistently along the parliamentary versus presidential distinction. The other, I mean, so one implication that's coming out of this work, I think, is that you might have executives that almost deliberately, this is maybe going straying into the normative terrain, that you might have executives that almost deliberately see that their emergencies don't ever really resolve for the sake of enjoying the increased benefits that they get. Would you go so far as to say that that's what's going on? I mean, that seemed to be the implication for one of the findings. The more benefit the executive derives, the more people can die. That was one of the points that you made. Is that how we should read or interpret that finding?
Thanks for the questions. So regarding federally constituted states, I mean, this is just an additional slide that I just opened. So what we are currently doing is looking into states of emergency in India. And this is a provision of the Indian Constitution, Article 356, which basically, let me try to summarize it in a halfway decent way. So basically, it gives the federal government the power to get rid of state governments, I should say. So what we are trying to find out is whether the party affiliations matter, in the sense that is a state government that is not sharing the same party affiliation with the federal government more likely to be kicked out as a consequence of a disaster than a state government that shares the same party affiliation with the federal government. That seems to be the case. So the issue of federal government, we are aware of, and we are doing this on India. This is, the numbers are fairly simple, but the problem is that there are many things you need to control for. For example, the size of the disaster. I mean, it could be that, or also the efficiency of government. It could be that, in different parts of India, local governments are more or less effective. So to the degree that they are less effective, taking over government business by the federal government, there might be more reason, there might be a better justification, etc. So we need to control for all of this. And India is a fascinating country in the sense that most data are available someplace. The issue is only where exactly. So putting together this data set is the challenge. It's not getting the data, but finding them and reorganizing them. It's a fascinating country in terms of data availability, but the way they are ordered or offered or presented is to a Westerner sometimes a bit surprising. So we are aware of the federalism issue. The other one is a very interesting question that you ask. And I've been interested in this, and unfortunately I cannot tell you any results. So people often make a distinction between various types of emergency constitutions, like the martial law type of common law system versus the état de siège French system. And it's one characteristic feature of the British common law, martial law type of system is that there is, at least in theory, there is ex post judicial review, right? So governments are subject to their actions that they have taken under a state of emergency being subject to judicial review afterwards. So I've always wondered to what degree, first of all, to what degree this is really implemented, to what degree this takes place. There are constitutions that basically bar judicial review from being applied to states of emergency. There are a couple of Asian constitutions that do that explicitly. But to the degree that judicial review might have bite afterwards, it might exactly induce the behavior that you are referring to. If I know that I will be subject to judicial review once the state of emergency is over, well, I have I should expect to have some incentive to just prolong it as far as I can. So I've been wanting to look at this, but again, this is still all work in progress. But I think there's a lot to what you're saying.
Thank you very much. I think unless there's anyone with a burning question, I will close the proceedings. I'd like to please join me in thanking Professor Voigt for really